I've been doing woodworking for 50 years. Overall, lumber prices have risen at a fairly regular rate, consistent with inflation. I've never seen fluctuations like those we've had in the last couple of years. In this video, I'll explain the reasons why the prices have been fluctuating so much, specifically how the pandemic affected and how the market has recovered. By the end, I'll be giving you some idea of what kind of prices you can expect to see in the next couple of years. So we've got to start out, of course, with the past. How did we get to where we are? And that's directly connected with the COVID-19 pandemic. Prices rose during the pandemic from $400 per thousand board feet. Now that's the commodity price. That's what they traded for on Wall Street, okay? To over $1,500. That's almost 4 times as much in a very short period of time. So why did that happen? Well, a lot of that rise in cost was due to some mistakes made by lumber industry executives who misread the situation and made some wrong assumptions, therefore some wrong decisions. First of all, housing starts, building new houses, which is the biggest single use of lumber in this country, they assumed they were going to drop, and they didn't drop. Mills, the sawmills that prepare the lumber, shut down or went into maintenance cycles, reducing the supply. Now those maintenance cycles can last a couple of months, and during that time they can't produce any lumber. So after that, yes, they can again, and maybe even better, but during that time they're stuck. And then there was a need to implement a lot of new safety protocols. You know, PPE, we're all doing the social distancing and the masks and, you know, all that hoopla we went through. But that caused shutdowns, slowdowns. It made them reevaluate how they were working. They had to get PPE in for the people. They had to work it out so that people didn't have to work as close together. So there are a lot of things that have affected the ability to produce the lumber, even in the sawmills that were still running. So, and then there was one other thing, and granted, I got to give them grace on this one because, you know, none of us are issued a crystal ball, and that is they did not foresee the increase in remodeling work that happened during COVID. Why did that happen? Well, there are people that are putting off projects because of one thing or another, and, oh, now I'm at home, I've got time, yeah, let's go ahead and do this. Or, oh, I'm working from home, now I need an office. We really need to do an add-on to the house, or we need to remodel this area in the basement or the attic or whatever. So a lot of remodeling projects, both done by homeowners and hired contractors, trying to adjust to the situation of COVID, which caused a need for lumber, okay? They didn't plan on that, and granted, I've got to say, I don't blame them. And then at the same time all this was going on, interest rates were at just about historic lows, meaning it was an ideal time to have homes built or to buy homes. And so that really pushed the housing industry. At the same time, the housing industry was having trouble getting lumber. So we ended up with a huge supply and demand problem. And anyone who remembers the law of supply and demand knows that when supply drops, price goes up, or when demand increases and the supply isn't there, price goes up. And that's exactly what happened. The average cost of building a new home during that time rose by about $35,000. Now this happened to my daughter and son-in-law. They contracted a house to be built, and shortly after they started construction, costs went up incredibly. The contractor was having all kinds of trouble. Subcontractors backed out of their contracts. In some cases, not their case, but in some cases, contractors just walked off the job because they couldn't afford to finish it. And so there are a lot of problems that happen in the housing market, and everything having to do with lumber is somehow connected to the housing market because that's the biggest use of lumber. Homes under construction were delayed because of cost problems. Some contractors went back to homeowners, renegotiated their contract. Homeowners had to look for additional financing. You know, people had to come up with the money to be able to deal with this situation. It got so bad that lumber became so valuable that thousands of dollars worth of lumber were stolen, out and out stolen from job sites, normally overnight, by people that were just seeing an opportunity and stealing that lumber. And so contractors would go showing up to work on a project the next day and not have the lumber they left there yesterday. Now they've got to order more lumber. Who knows if the lumber yard's going to have it? I remember during that time going to my local sawmill or lumber yard or going to Home Depot looking for lumber for a project I wanted to do, and the lumber was not there on the shelves. I had to wait till I could get it. This video is sponsored by ourselves. Yes, that's right. We don't have corporate sponsors here paying for this work, but there's an opportunity for you to become one of our sponsors. All you've got to do is check out and maybe even buy the tools we're selling on our website.
These are all tools I've selected myself and use right here in my workshop. You may even have seen me use some of them in my videos. And we even give you instructional videos on how to get the most out of those tools. There should be a button down there somewhere, but if not, just hop on over to our website at sawnary.net and check out the great tools we're offering.
So this lasted for several months. This was an ongoing process that went through the spring and summer of 2020. And then in the fall, the lumberyard started catching up again, and we saw lumber prices drop from that high of $1,500, almost $1,600 per 1,000 board feet down to $800 per board foot. That's almost a 50% drop, but it's still double what it was before the COVID started. It was still a problem. It has slowly dropped since then, but it was still a serious problem. Now, realize when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about softwood. I'm talking about 2x4s, 1x4s. I'm talking about pine dimensional lumber that we buy in the lumberyard that we ourselves use for projects, but are also used for construction, okay? But that becomes the baseline for everything else. Plywood went up to ridiculous prices. Plywood was almost $100 a sheet. For half-inch plywood and 3/4-inch plywood, it became extremely expensive to do pretty much anything. It also caused upward pressure on the price of hardwoods. And even though hardwoods shouldn't have been affected by that, the fact that the sawmills couldn't keep up with demand also affected the price of hardwoods. Okay, so that's the past. That's what got us into a mess in the first place, all right? Now we got to realize that during that time, some lumberyards closed down permanently, all right? And you don't just reopen. You know, some were mothballed and they were able to reopen them. Some of them were just shut down and that was the end of that sawmill. The equipment was sold off. Maybe they were old sawmills and it was just too difficult to bring them up to speed to get them open yet. I don't know the specifics. So prices of lumber continue to drop through to the end of the pandemic and the time since then up to now. In this year, 2024, prices peaked at $617 in March. In other words, the end of 2023, they were lower than that. They were down around $500, okay? It dropped to $454 in mid-year, and now, right now, the price is above $500 again, all right? I'm talking to you. So it's up over $500. I seriously doubt we're going to see a drop below $500 a board, 1,000 board feet again. And there's various reasons for that. Partially, again, supply and demand. They're not going to rebuild those sawmills that were shuttered, okay? The reason there was a dip in prices in the middle of 2024, what should have been the peak time for the construction industry, is that interest rates have been climbing over the last few years, largely due to inflation, and that is mostly not due to corporate greed, as some people like to say, but actually due to the several $trillion+ spending bills that Congress has passed, both for the COVID pandemic and then the infrastructure bill, all these $1 trillion bills. So what happens whenever they do that is that the federal government borrows money from the Federal Reserve, who just creates money out of thin air, and essentially the way they do that ends up diluting the value of every dollar you have in your pocket. Every dollar ends up being worth a little bit less. That's why in the last 100 years, what you could buy for 12 cents, you now buy for $1. That's basically what it is. A lot of people like to blame corporate greed for inflation, but that's a secondary cause of inflation. In other words, corporations have to deal with the inflation that is already pre-existing, that's been caused by the government, it's been caused by Congress passing those $1 trillion bills. And when that happens, they raise their prices. Do they raise them just enough to cover the increase? Usually they raise them a little more than that. Why? Because they expect prices to keep going up. So that's why people say, oh, corporations have had record-breaking profits. Yeah, they have, because they've tried to account for what's happening to the economy. We're still in high inflation right now, even as I speak. And so yes, they've had it, but the root cause of the inflation was government activity. Anyway, this is not an economics discussion. This is not a political discussion. We're trying to look at what happened to us as far as the lumber that we need. Okay, so this is what's happened to lumber prices. We have to understand that lumber is considered, at least on Wall Street, a commodity. Just like pork bellies, where bacon comes from, and gold and silver and a lot of other things, petroleum. Prices rise and fall based on investment, based on the investors. And that's really mostly psychology. It's not that a board increases in value or a barrel of oil increases in value. It's how people think the market is going to react and how they invest. And that's a whole nother animal, and I really don't understand it. But lumber prices do rise and fall according to market conditions. There's also a couple other things that affect it. Economic shifts, in other words, loan rates. I mentioned a moment ago that in the summer of 2024, new housing starts dropped because of the high cost of interest. A lot of people are waiting for interest to come back down before they build the home of their dreams. Okay? So if you take a large chunk of people, and it doesn't take that big a chunk to really impact it, you end up with a drop in new housing starts of what has been this year 4 to 6%, which may not seem a lot, but that's a huge number when you talk about actual individual houses and carpenters that it affects, and plumbers it affects, and electricians it affects, and also the amount of lumber that is used. Now, natural events are another thing that really impacts this. We've just recently been hit with 2 major hurricanes that have hit the south and southeast. Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton. They have destroyed an incredible amount of agriculture. Cotton has been destroyed, pecan trees. Most of the pecans in the country are grown in what's known as the deep south, and so you can expect the price of pecans to go up. You don't just replace a pecan crop. Now, a cotton crop, if the cotton crop gets destroyed, that causes cotton prices to go. Well, next year they'll plant more cotton and hopefully have a good harvest, and cotton will go back to normal. You plant pecan trees this year to replace the ones, or have to actually probably be in the spring to replace the ones that were recently destroyed. And it might be 10 to 20 years before they're really fruitful at the point where it restabilizes the price. So we're going to expect pecans to go up quite a bit. But I've seen report after report after report coming across my Facebook feed of people talking about trees down in their yard and on their property, hardwood trees, walnut, maple, pecan, cherry trees, all kinds of things, large trees that are down, and that's wood that is essentially going to be lost. Now, some of those people are woodworkers, and they'll do what they can to salvage the wood, but most of them aren't woodworkers. And if it's happening on private property, it's also happening on public property. It's also happening in the land where they harvest those trees. So that's going to have an upward pressure on the cost of domestic hardwoods over the next few years. Now, what about foreign hardwoods? Well, or what we call exotic hardwoods. Okay, all exotic hardwoods come from overseas somewhere. Well, the thing that impacts that the most, of course, hurricanes or cyclones can impact that in some parts of the country. They can have natural disasters which can kill off a lot of trees. But the biggest thing that impacts the cost of that wood as far as you and I are concerned are tariffs. And tariff prices go up and down as government regulations change. And a fair amount of our wood, even our softwood, comes from overseas. You know, every board I've bought, every piece of 1x whatever I have bought over the last several months, I've noticed has a sticker on it that said made in Sweden. Now, I'm talking about wood I've bought at Home Depot. Why is it coming from Sweden? I don't know. Apparently they can get it from Sweden for a lower price. They can get it from, say, Washington State or Oregon. I just know that that's what I'm seeing. So if tariffs go up, then the cost of that wood will go down. Maybe that means they'll be doing more cutting of domestic wood because that'll be cheaper, but it's going to make an impact. Those same tariffs affect all the exotic hardwoods that we get. So we can expect anytime tariffs go up, we can see a raise in tariffs. Okay, so looking at all this, where are we going in the future? Well, I've already just mentioned the hurricane activity that we've had in 2024, and that has destroyed literally billions of dollars worth of timber, which ends up being even more billions of dollars worth of finished lumber, okay? How big an impact that's actually going to be, I'm sure is still being calculated. It's going to affect more than just lumber. It's not just trees that were damaged, but the trees have, the longest term impact. How much of that wood actually manages to get salvaged depends largely on the homeowners or the property owners of that property and whether they have the capability of harvesting the wood or getting somebody in to harvest the wood and turn it into usable lumber. Some of those people will want to save that for themselves. Some of them will just say, it's just firewood. You know, there's going to be a variety of different responses. Since few people have the ability to mill that wood themselves, probably a lot of it will just go to waste. And it'll take decades for those trees to regrow. Increased demand for lumber to rebuild from the hurricanes is also going to cause upward pressure on lumber prices. Okay, so in the short term, we can expect pine and other softwoods to go up in price. You know, our regular construction grade lumber, we can expect that to go back up again. We're at a little over $500 a thousand board feet right now at a commodity level. Okay, we can probably expect that to go up another $100, say, in the next couple of months, maybe $200 in the next couple of months. That means our 1x4s and our 1x8s and all that's going to go up in price as well. Another thing that's going to affect us for the future is I mentioned about sawmills that have been closed down. Well, they're not likely to be reopened, and they're not likely to be replaced. So that we're looking there as, okay, that's not going to, the prices aren't going to be brought back down by opening more sawmills, because there's more investment required than there is a potential return on investment. But I think the biggest long-term impact that we've got to look at is what's happening to forests and jungles worldwide. I already said that all the exotic hardwoods come from overseas. Much of that is from third world countries, in which the sale of timber and the sale of lumber is a major cash crop for them. Now, there are those who complain about people cutting down trees in the rainforest, and I understand their concern, but to the people living in those rainforests, that's money. That's payday for them, and they need that to do that. Also, in many cases, they need to clear land for agriculture. Now, of course, here in the United States, if we clear land like that, if we clear cut forests for lumber, we replant. And the question is, do they do that in these countries? They don't do necessarily the same things we do. They don't have the same laws. They don't have the same regulations. They don't have the same attitude about their environment. And so, will they be replaced? Hopefully, but we can't guarantee that, okay? What's going on right now, and has been going on for a number of years, is we're seeing that the old growth trees, the old growth timber is pretty much been harvested. Now, what do I mean by old growth? I'm talking about trees that are 150 years old, 200 years old, that have been harvested to give the world the hardwoods that they want. A prime example is ebony. There's very little to no old growth ebony left in the world. Now, ebony has been used for a couple of centuries now as a dark accent wood. You know, the ebony keys, the dark keys on the piano. There's lots of other places it's been used. Mahogany is another very popular wood that was used for years for furniture building. Teak is predominantly used where it's been exposed to weather, such as in boats, in shipbuilding. Okay, now a lot of boats today are fiberglass and metal, but luxury boats, yachts, personal pleasure craft, there's still a fair amount of teak that's used. Well, teak is becoming more and more scarce. We're seeing more and more of these really precious timbers that people appreciate becoming more and more scarce because of having been cut off. And so what we're seeing now is what's called new growth. And what new growth is that, okay, they cut those teak trees down, and somebody had the foresight to plant whatever sort of seed so that new ones can grow, and now they're starting to cut some of those trees. But those trees are 50 years old. They're not 150 years old. So the quality of the wood isn't as good. And in the case of teak, it isn't necessarily black, but it's brown. A lot of the new teak you see, the new growth teak you see being used, is actually stained to look like teak because it looks brown instead of black. Okay? Now, I've bought some teak, and I've had some that was black, but I've had a lot that was a mix of black and brown. And if you want it to be black, yeah, you gotta stain it. So what we're getting is a lot of this new growth, and it's not the same thing. The rings, even on pine, the rings are spaced farther apart. The trees were grown faster. The quality of the lumber isn't the same as it used to be. And we can expect that not only with domestic woods, but all in all woods. More and more species of lumber, more and more species of trees are becoming vulnerable or even becoming extinct. Now, there's a lot of work being done worldwide to try and keep them from going extinct. But as I said a moment ago, not all countries are on board with that. For some people, hey, that's a cash crop. I need that money. But nowadays, trying to get some woods, like the ones I mentioned, or even like rosewood, you can't get rosewood that's imported from certain countries. You can't get teak that's imported from certain countries, okay? So as these woods become more and more endangered or the quantity available is lessened, we're going to see the prices continue to go up, and we'll even see shortages. We'll see our government put regulations in place to limit or even stop the importation of some of these types of wood here to the United States. If you want specifics on that, on a specific type of wood, I recommend looking up the wood database. It is in a book and it's also available online, and the wood database provides specific information about a huge variety of different types of woods. And it's a great resource when you're trying to choose woods for a project. You're trying to see things like, is this wood toxic? Is it readily available? Where in the world does it come from? What does it look like? Is there a difference between this wood if it comes from this country or that country? A lot of good information you can garner from the wood database. I recommend setting up a link on your, or a bookmark on your browser so that you can get access to it when you need it. So what am I saying with all this? What I'm saying is we're going to see that wood prices are just going to continue to increase. You and I are going to have to learn how to be more efficient in the use of our lumber so that we don't waste as much. So that we get the best possible product out of our lumber, which may mean mixing lumber, mixing woods, using more plywood, say a hardwood plywood, or veneering over a plywood rather than using hardwood. Now these are things that have been going on for years. This is nothing new, but you and I as woodworkers need to consider, how do we maintain the cost of our hobby, the cost of the projects that we do, so that they don't get out of hand. And that means being cautious in our use of wood and being very selective in our use of wood. It might also mean buying lower grades of wood, say like walnut, where we need to cut out pieces of the wood because of knot holes or whatever, and take what's left and use it. That might make a project more affordable, okay? It might mean buying rough sawn lumber and doing the finishing work ourselves. It may mean keeping our eyes open for trees that are down, or even limbs that are down for trees that have use, like say an oak tree. And when we're driving by a house and they've got an oak tree down, offering to cut that tree up and haul the wood off so that we can use that wood, either turn it into boards ourselves or find a sawmill that we can get to turn it into wood so that we can have that wood at a reasonable price. So all is not lost by any means. We just need to be cautious in how we approach our hobby, our craft, and we need to be a little creative in how we get our lumber so that we can keep our prices reasonable and we can enjoy our woodworking.